Okay, so thank you everyone for attending. My name's Ming. I'm one of the academic foundation doctors at St. George's Hospital, and we'll be going over the AFP interview. So a basic overview of what's going to happen. I think what I'll start by doing is talking a little bit about myself as a student and the path that I took in order to go to the AFP, why I chose the one I did, and then we'll delve into the main bulk of the talk, which is going to be centered around the clinical scenario and critical literature appraisal. Keep in mind that due to my own experiences, it's going to differ from what you may experience, but we'll get to that shortly in a little bit. So this is a bit of a cringy part where you have to talk about yourself. I started out, I did a JEP program, so the graduate entry program at St. George's. Before I started that, I did a minor in classical studies, honors in chemistry, and then a master's in chemistry. And then I came over to the UK and studied medicine. During med school, I think a lot of people wonder about things with regards to research, mainly how do I do it, what is it, and what skills do I need? You actually don't need that huge amount of formal training. You just need to be able to put in a lot of time and effort and hard work, and the skills will come along with time. I was mainly just quite lucky in that one of the people who I met, who became one of my best friends, she had a PhD in epidemiology and study methodology. So she got me linked with a lot of different people, and I was able to work on a lot of different projects. So before going into the AFP, I had a few articles published from my master's in chemistry, unrelated to medicine. And I did a couple of meta-analyses with her through the groups that I've met. And through that, I've gained skills to the point where now I can do all the data analysis, all the literature, search appraisals and screening and everything like that to be able to, first author my own kind of studies, which are currently in print. So look out for those. Great. So a good amount of this talk is going to be centered around the London AFP interview. And that's going to be for two main reasons. One, I went to it. And the other one being that the core skills that you gain from understanding what the London interview process is kind of carries over largely to a lot of different interview processes that you might have. So for example, if you went to, got an interview at Oxford, it may change, but it was a panel interview, and the sessions were a little bit longer, and they can ask you more questions, more and more questions, especially if you're quite well developed in a particular area. I myself interviewed at London and at Birmingham. With a little bit of luck, I got my first choice for both, and the main reason I chose the one that I did in London is because I wanted to do a career in plastics. And it was the only London AFP that had that as a surgical rotation. And in addition, it's 2 years at the same hospital, so I think it's quite convenient not to have to move around too much and know exactly where you work and get acquainted with the actual staff there. So for the London interview itself, you'll be given 25 minutes to read both a clinical scenario and, no text there, fine. Along with the abstract of a study. You'll never be given more than the actual abstract because it would just take way too long. You can allocate however much time you want, and you can take notes. And those notes you can actually take into the actual stations with you. You can't take the actual printout that they give you initially. The London one's always going to be rigid. It's structured. It's quite like, you're very much just a number. And you can definitely get that vibe going into it. You'll have two interviewers at every single station, and they may ask you questions right off the bat, follow up with questions on every single point you bring up, or they might just smile and nod the entire time and not give you anything. So the structure in your own experience is going to be quite varied, and you'll hear a lot of different things from different people depending on what they actually get. And when I interviewed at Birmingham, it was quite similar in that you had a very clear-cut clinical scenario and sessions and what you would do, where you can demonstrate, how you would manage and assess a patient. And then a few more open-ended questions about your own experiences in research, teaching, personal interests, and career development. So I think the personal side of questions that you might get randomly at different interviews, you should know yourself well enough to be able to answer that correctly. So I don't think it's worthwhile for me to go over that at all. Wait, here we go. So the clinical scenario, generally speaking, it's going to be kind of a ridiculous situation that pretty much never happens. And in line with that, you can kind of milk it as much as you want. You can tell people to do things, knowing that in real life it would never happen as smoothly as that. And you'll find that it's actually not about how good you are at managing one particular situation, but you do need to be good at managing any sort of particular emergencies that might come up. It's more so about your thoughts and reasoning in terms of assessing the situation and prioritizing which one might be more important than the other. And also, it'll be kind of a showcase about how well you know the structure of how hospitals work. You know, what kind of staff available to you have what kind of competencies. You know, for example, some jobs you can leave to a nurse, some jobs you would seek advice from the med reg for. So I'll leave it here for 20 seconds just for you to read. We're not going to delve into this situation too much, but this is kind of an example of what things can come up. So while you, oh, I guess you can't read that if I have that.
We can only ever see your screen. So
Thanks.
you don't need to worry about the Q&A boxes.
Okay. I'll give you like 20 more seconds. Right, so hopefully that's long enough time for you to have a read of what it's about and have a little bit of think on your own about how you would handle the situation and whatnot. I'll take you over some general tips that I found helpful when I was practicing for these kinds of things. Oh God. Oh, there we go. So I think you should approach the interviewers as if they don't know what you're talking about at all. I found it helpful to go about it in two different ways. The first is to explain to the interviewer or examiner exactly what situation has happened and your thoughts on every single situation. So lay out what's going on, lay out what you think might be happening with each patient, and then say, because of my rationalization, I would see patient X first, patient Y second, and here is my reasoning. And when you go and assess each patient, you then can delve into your actual primary survey of A to E, and how you would escalate X, Y, Z. And then the second part that I think is equally as important is these things don't happen simultaneously and they don't happen instantly. They happen in real time. So you need to describe what you would do in that instant in a chronological order. So based on that, you see one patient, but you need to make someone aware of the other patient who you might be worried about. So you might bleep a member of your team, escalate to a senior, ask nurses to set up cannulas, get a set of obs and everything ready so that you waste less time assessing the patient when you actually go see them. And you really do need to use the entire multidisciplinary team and understand the various resources around the hospital. That's going to distinguish you between someone, that's going to distinguish you from someone who basically just knows all the treatment algorithms and guidelines really well, and someone who knows them really well, but has seen them in practice through their own clinical placements. And it's a very important and underrated thing, but you need to be confident, because if you are wrong, you're already wrong. And you could either be wishy-washy about it, in which case you kind of convey a sense that you didn't really know what you were talking about to begin with, or you could be confident, in which case you kind of convey that, okay, they knew everything that they were doing, they've clearly done the work, but they probably just remembered this one thing wrong. And one particular thing that I think is helpful is there are better resources out there than the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine, but it's all based on British guidelines, which is really important. And there's a nice section in it that is just classified as emergencies. And these are the kinds of things you need to worry about and know the treatment algorithms and dosing really well. And that'll kind of help you differentiate yourself when you actually give your answers about what to do in the clinical scenario. So the critical appraisal part, there's no perfect way of doing it. There's a lot of right ways, but there's tons of wrong ways. It's not necessarily important because when you read an abstract, in your head, you have an understanding, an idea of what has actually happened, what information's been conveyed to you. That's not what really the station is about. It's about you being able to communicate to other people in a salient manner what the information is, and then more specifically, your personal thoughts on it and how you think the study itself and its findings would kind of apply to general practice, to clinical practice. So yeah, reiterating based on the facts that we've talked about, understanding, describing, critiquing, it is the core of the station. You need to do it well, but you need to think about the applications as well. So such things, as patient experience, cost-benefit analysis, ethics of the study itself are really important. Some stations, and also depending on where you interview, be prepared for some open questions regarding research in general. They might just ask you to give the definitions of, what's the difference between a case series versus a cohort study. So you need to know those things well. Obviously, you won't have time to read it. This is just an example, and you can go over this on your own time. So don't freak out now. You generally won't get a very short abstract because otherwise there's not very much to talk about. You'll likely get something that's quite substantial. So good places to find examples of studies that you might be asked to critique or appraise would be the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, that kind of thing, really big journals. And when you're reading this, there's tons of information here already, but it's not the entire study. So you'll never formulate a definitive opinion. But you do have a lot of useful information, and I recommend jotting down in your notes while you're reading something like this, the key points that you want to refer to and talk about. So having a look at that, it doesn't matter what the content was. Questions you need to be asking yourself at the very basic structure and the very basic level is, what was the study actually looking at? And what was this actual study design? Was it prospective, retrospective? Was it a randomized controlled trial? Was it you won't get a case report, but is it a case report, case series, yada, yada, yada. Or was it a meta-analysis or a systematic review? How did they find and pick and choose their patients? What interventions did they examine? And how were they compared to other interventions? Were they compared to the gold standard? Were they just compared to each other? And how's that comparison made? Is it a superiority? Is it a non-superiority? And what outcomes did they actually look at? And more specifically, a little bit more in detail, you can talk about, were there any ethical issues? You should know the differences between the study designs, as I've previously mentioned. How were the patients chosen? The study design and how the patients were chosen and how the outcomes are reported, it can create room for a lot of different things, sources of bias. And that's something that you can talk about as well. Why these interventions? What are the pros and cons of each? And that's a good time to actually think about patient experience. And we'll get to that in a second. Yeah, and at the end of it, what did they find? And how would this change clinical decisions? So if you consider the study as a whole, let's say that they were testing one drug versus another in the treatment of, say, breast cancer. And they found that the latter drug is, incredibly superior. It saves tons more lives. But in reality, it costs maybe 100 times as much. Is that really going to be put into practice? Can the NHS afford it? Probably not. Or likewise, let's say they find this new drug that they developed is just as effective as the old one and it's cheaper. And you might say, well, that's really great. But the drug profile itself might be really dirty. It might have a lot of different side effects. Patients might absolutely hate it. So you might not actually want to implement that into clinical practice. So obviously the main bones, the meat and potatoes of critical appraisal is the bigger highlighted texts. And these are smaller points that if you have time, you need to talk about. And I think it's quite useful to talk about them because it shows that you have a thought process. You didn't just read and regurgitate. You actually think. I guess the general advice is you need to practice lots. For myself, it's my own experience was, at the beginning of it, I'd rehearse, I'd understand exactly what I want to do in a clinical scenario, or I'd understand the article and my thoughts on it, but actually, verbalizing it to someone else so that they understand in a meaningful way is actually quite difficult. And another thing is, as you get better, you might find that you're really, really comfortable rehearsing with your friends or housemates and whatnot. And it makes sense to do it often with them because they're very available. But you need to practice with people you don't know well because you won't know the interviewers. And that will put an extra degree of stress on something that's already relatively stressful. And try different styles too if you're practicing with friends. So for example, you're practicing with a friend who always, just stays silent. Try practicing with someone who constantly asks you questions and interrupts you. It helps you deal with it so that when it actually comes up, you're not flustered and thrown off your train of thought. That's pretty much it for the bare of it. I think it's probably a bit more helpful if I ask and answer some general questions about the interview itself. So I guess I'll open it up to questions. I'll start looking at the Q&A now and try and answer some questions. So the question for my friend with a PhD, she applied for the AFP, got her first choice, I think at Tommy's. She declined it because she went back to Canada. The development of the AFP originally was aimed for people who were, driven and whatnot, had interest in research, and it gave them an opportunity to do so. What it's become now is basically almost reserved for people who have done some research in the past, which is a bit unfortunate. Rehearsing different interview styles. I think I said this, but again, just sometimes be deadpan, give them nothing, and other times, for example, if you're going through your A to E, you might say, for airway, blah, 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 I would do this, breathing, I would do this, circulation, yada, yada, yada. Sometimes they'll interrupt you and say, okay, well, you're on breathing now, their sats are actually 95, or they'll say their sats are dropping, and they'll give you live feedback information. So that's what I mean by different styles. And sometimes they'll just be really happy and not along, but it doesn't necessarily correlate with how well you do. How early did I start prepping for the AFP? Not long, actually. So mine was, if I remember correctly, around the mid-January period. I started about a month and a half before, but it wasn't dedicated practice where I rehearsed every day. It's just, you're obviously busy with med school and living, hopefully doing a little bit of social activities. So it's quite interspersed. Obviously the week leading up to it, I would kind of look at something every day. If you have time, just spend 15 minutes a day, find a random abstract and just jot down some notes on it and your thoughts on it. So the interview is going to vary depending on where you go, but generally speaking, the AFPs are offered at large tertiary care centers affiliated with a university. So you're going to get a lot of applicants no matter what. And as a result, you will find that your time's pretty limited. So yeah, generally you get about 10 minutes per station. I think at some of the panel interviews that my friend went to at Oxford, I think she got up to about 25 minutes, just kind of freestyling with one of the panels, because she had done a lot of research and had a lot to talk about. Should I do an AFP or an if an intercalated PhD, I suppose it's your, I would, it depends on your reasoning and rationale behind doing them. If you're doing it because you actually want to do a career in research, I recommend just doing a normal PhD. An intercalated one where you take some time out of clinical training to do it, I don't know. That seems like so many years of commitment. I don't know if it's worth it. If you're actually passionate about research and it's something you want to do in the future, I think you should allocate a good amount of time to properly do a PhD, because otherwise it'll disrupt your clinical practice. But it depends on the program that you have in mind. I would say doing an AFP is never a bad thing because it's pretty much identical to the foundation program, um, minus a little glitz and glam of saying that you have an AFP. So I recommend doing it, or at least applying for it. And if you get it, great. But if you don't, it doesn't detract from your foundation training whatsoever. How would you approach an interview where they ask you, tell us about a paper you've read? Example, Oxford. Well, one, you should read a lot of papers, and hopefully it's in an area that you're interested in, so that you actually have a little bit of passion and it can actually show through when you're talking about it. And I think I would talk about it in the same way that you critically appraise something. You can say, I've read a study looking at allograft versus autograft for PCL reconstructions. And this is really interesting because this study found that contrary to popular or traditional beliefs, allograft is actually superior, blah, 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 blah. And this is actually quite a monumental thing because you can have cadaveric allografts and it might make the donation pool a lot more readily available, that kind of thing. You just talk about a study that you found that is interesting to something that you want to do. So the long listing, short listing, and whatnot, I'm not too familiar with for Birmingham. It wasn't clear cut and pasted as London. I know for London, they're all going to be similar processes. They'll have a cutoff decile wise to just kind of use more so as a means of just limiting number of people that they have a closer look at in terms of their actual portfolio and applications. And then the shortlisting is going to be based on the Birmingham ones. It's got a lot more white box answers compared to London's. London's was very much, what research do you have? What awards do you have? What decile were you? And that was it. Birmingham, they asked a lot more open-ended questions. More so about, what experiences do you have in teaching? What are your thoughts on research as a whole? That kind of stuff. Or, how do you expect or plan to make up the missed block of clinical experience that your other colleagues would have? What are the disadvantages of the AFP program? You could hate it, I suppose, is one. And it's more rigid in its structure in that you're not allowed to swap your blocks, unlike other people. So I guess that is a disadvantage. But in terms of its actual layout and content, you do an A&E rotation, you do some medicine, you do some GP, and you do some surgery. So it's pretty much identical to a foundation program. I don't think the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. I don't recommend getting a book. People do. A friend of mine did, and she did fantastic. So I guess rather than not recommending it, if you have time, read one. But I didn't. You can literally, it's not these books that you get that teach you how to critically appraise and whatnot. They'll go into so much more detail than you'll ever be able to get out in the short amount of time that you actually have. You have a short amount of time and you need to answer their questions specifically very well. And it's not a time where you throw in random things that you did that are unrelated to kind of, that you think will make yourself look better. And in terms of practicing, I think just doing daily practice, maybe not daily, that's a bit too over the top. Just grab an abstract every 2-3 days, have a read, and it kind of trains your brain to read them in a way that dissects the useless information from the ones that are actually important. And just practice making notes as you go along. If you have someone to practice with and talk about the thing that you read to, that's great. If not, you can just sit there and speak it out and time yourself. I interviewed both at Birmingham and London, and I got my first pick at both. If you decline it, then you're out. So here's how it works. If you get an offer, let's say you get one offer, okay? You applied to 2 places, you get one offer. If you decline it, then yeah, you withdraw your application from the AFP, and someone else gets that spot who was waitlisted, who didn't achieve a high enough score in order to get one right off the bat. So they can pick up yours if they want it, or it goes to the next person in line. If you get 2, you can choose either one. They all come out around the same time period, I think within like hours of each other, and you have 48 hours to decide. If you decline both, then you withdraw your application just as if you only had one offer. But if you accept one, you automatically withdraw the offer from the other one. No, the application process for all of them are done through Oriole. So it's a very centralized system, not the most user-friendly, but pretty straightforward. But the actual format of it is going to look pretty different. So again, London was very list your credentials and hope for the best. Other places, they have large white box answers that you can, type essays for. I don't think I did that ever. So I suppose it is different. And because they offer those white box answers, it is a good opportunity, I guess, to talk about your own personal experiences and a little bit more about yourself in general. But no, it's not drastically different. I apologize if this is slightly unrelated. Okay, good to off to a good start. But what are some of the things that you can start doing in the early years of medical school so you can be better prepared for the interview? Oh, that's not unrelated at all. That's not unrelated at all. That's a very good question. So I think for people who are near the end of their medical school training, don't worry about it. Starting now is better than starting a year later, but the earlier you start, the better. And I would say don't try and prepare for this interview. The purpose of med school is to learn how to be a good and safe doctor. But if you have this goal in mind that you want to do an AFP and you're interested in research in the future, the things that you can do are have an understanding of what the criteria are. For example, London's very well publicized. They list exactly what they want. And every single school you apply to are going to look for very similar things. White box answers might make a difference a little bit, but at the end of the day, if you are in the top decile versus the bottom decile, it's kind of clear cut. I would say just know your clinical stuff really well, actually go to your placements. And I think when you do go to placements, go kind of with the attitude that you are there to actually learn as opposed to being just helpful. Because that's what you're paying for. That's what your time is there for. So the more you actually learn and talk to people about and get a better understanding of how teams work and whatnot, and you pick up useful information, I think that's a good way to go about it, because asking people clinical questions about certain diseases and treatments and things like that, you're going to get a lot of anecdotal evidence, and you're better off just reading a textbook. When you're at placement, you're there to learn and see stuff that are interesting, as opposed to just being helpful by being, like a document monkey. For the interview itself, I think does that answer it? If it doesn't, you can ask it again, okay? So having a supervisor in mind, and this is of course purely anecdotal, my friend's experience at the Oxford one, and you can only apply to two, by the way. You can't apply to more than two. So she said that most of the people there had already had a supervisor in mind and had a project that they would have undertaken had they gotten the position. So I think it's certainly helpful, but for London, it's not something that's ever asked. It is helpful from a personal and practical point of view, because if you have a project in mind, you can start working on it as soon as you get your acceptance. So yeah, it's not a bad thing to have, but it's not, it wouldn't be a make or break. Oh yeah, I think I just kind of covered this. Unlike the foundation program where you basically rank all the jobs within a deanery, you only can choose 2 deaneries to apply to for the AFP. Were there only 2 stations? And was the critical appraisal abstract linked to your chosen? Oh, absolutely not. That's a bit of a pipe dream, I think, to have them think that they can tailor everything for everyone. They basically just find really big studies like Lancet, again, New England Journal of Medicine are good places to look for. And it won't be linked to your area of interest at all, unless, you know, if it does, it's just purely by coincidence. So try and read articles from a variety of different topics. That, I believe, will happen tomorrow, probably. Team structure, not really. If you just go to placement, you can kind of get a sense of what the F1s do, what the SHOs do, what the med regs deal with, what jobs can be delegated to nurses and what jobs can't be. The relationships and interplay between different teams of the hospital, you know, be it psychiatry or patient advice and liaison services, bereavement, you know, nursing staff, XYZ. It's just about personal experience. I don't think there's there's a good resource for this. Just go to your placements. Oh, so typically, as you saw in the example that I gave, essentially you'll have at least 1 or 2 actual medical issues and other things that might require a lot of sitting down and comm skills. So I would recommend reading through the emergency section in the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine. They're not going to give you something rare and fantastic. It'll be someone who, you know, has an exacerbation of asthma and another person who has maybe an upper GI bleed, something like that. So prepare for those. Yeah, just look at all the emergencies. You should know the emergencies and how to manage them really well. You should know your A to E like the back of your hand or the front of your hand, depending on which one you know better. How should you approach answering the general questions? Example, why do you want to do an AFP? You should know your own reasons for doing the things you want. So for example, okay, so for me, if I was asked that question and I wasn't, I would say I've become interested throughout my medical education in research, and it's something that I want to further. And I think this program offers, you know, a unique opportunity for me to develop my skills in that field. And you know, for the London one, I think I would say from a practical sense, it offers a sense of convenience because I have 2 years in the same trust in the same hospital, and I can get better acquainted to the systems, become more efficient as an actual doctor, and get to know all the teams around me and how you know. And specifically, I would say I want to be a plastic surgeon, so it's the only one that offers that rotation. So whatever reasons you might have, you should say it, unless it looks prestigious and I want it. Um, don't be too honest, but yeah. I have intensive care, acute medicine, plastic surgery, A&E, and rest medicine. A&E and rest medicine are in second year, and then I have my research block at the end of F2. And they're both years are St. George's. That largely depends on your supervisor with regards to choosing your own project. If you have a project in mind, and your supervisor is one of those really chill types like mine is, you can basically do whatever you want. But keep in mind that the AFPs do have certain titles and areas that they're kind of classified under. So it'll be, say, vascular surgery or GP or renal medicine. So if you apply for that, I would go in with the expectations that you would do research in that field. But it can be really, really open because, research doesn't always go the way you want. Just because you want to do research in something doesn't necessarily mean it's going to pan out. How would you answer that question about the missed clinical block? Well, there's tons of things you can do to gain further clinical experience. You can take up teaching positions to teach clinical skills to medical students. You can take up teaching sessions to teach anatomy. You can do locum shifts, especially as all the research blocks are in year 2. They're not in year 1. So by that time, you have a decent understanding of, how to practice medicine as a doctor through your foundation training in the first year, and you can pick up some locum shifts. And that's not only a great way to earn some extra money, but a way to stay engaged and deal with patients. So I think that's actually what I said at Birmingham. When was your interview? I don't remember the date, man. I think January 14th, 15th, something like that. I think that rings a bell. And another advantage, I think, of the AFP is that you find out in advance prior to foundation program applications. So you have a bit more security. And, a big advantage, the SJT, it doesn't matter. So perfect if you're a sociopath. Was the supervisor support, what was the supervisor, this doesn't make grammatical sense. Was the supervisor support you had it does make sense, sorry. No, it wasn't. My guy basically doesn't do anything. As long as you have a project in mind, he's happy to give you a pat on the back and support it all the way. Others will work a lot more closely with you and teach you along the way. So it's really greatly varied. Mine was not what I expected. And I think if I was someone who didn't have any research skills at all or experience, and I got this position thinking that I was going to pick it up, that'd be a major hindrance, and I would regret that. But luckily, it doesn't apply, so ha. How should you approach giving answers for F1 task prioritization? I think I covered this, so if you watch the video, again, essentially I would lay it out as an overview of explaining to them what the situation is ahead of you, that you've read, that you've understood, and your thoughts on each particular situation. What could be going on in here, what could be going on over there, and then triaging it in a way of 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I would go in a chronological manner of saying, based on my prioritization of the tasks given to me, I would go see this patient. On my way there, I would try and brief the med reg to make them aware of the other patient and get advice on the sick one that I'm about to see. I would ask the nurses to set up IV access, get a set of obs, yada, yada, yada. How do we get in contact with research labs for AFP though? Thanks. Well, you're welcome. Research labs. Generally, research is going to be carried out by different groups. It's not necessarily a lab, kind of like it is in, say, chemistry, where you have, a leading professor who has a bunch of different postdocs, PhD students, master students. It is kind of a shitty process. Sometimes different universities have services whereby they link medical students who are interested with doctors or professors who, are aware of that service, and they say, I'm looking for people for data collection for this one study. And then that's an easy way to be recruited. Otherwise, if you're interested in, say, cardiology, be diligent about it. Email every single cardiologist at the hospital, and then email them again. And eventually one person will respond. There's no spoon feeding here. You just got to do it. Does getting onto AFP mean that you get given rotations at the same hospital? Oh, that's a good question. It doesn't always apply. So the only ones in London that had 2 years in the same rotation were the AFPs offered at King's College Hospital and at St. George's Hospital. And those were the only ones I ranked. Out of the 125 that were available, I only ranked like 10 of them because I didn't want to move around, because that sucks. But yeah, most of the other ones, it's actually pretty much identical to the foundation program. You just have a year in, year out. Sorry if you said this already, I joined late. Are all the rotations available on Oreo when you apply for AFP? Yes, they are. Yeah, so you would rank them ahead of time when you apply, and then you'll get them. It's tough to explain the system because I don't have it in front of me to show you, but it's relatively self-explanatory. You'll rank everything that you want in the order that you want, and based on your score and other people's rankings, you'll get the highest one that you can possibly get. Plan post AFP. This might not necessarily apply to you guys too much, so feel free to zone out if it doesn't apply. I'm kind of open. I don't plan on doing an F3. As a graduate entry student, I'm already a bit older than your normal F1. So I don't have too many years to kick around and do an F3, F4, F5 where I go to Australia and drink beer and barely do any medicine. I'm applying for core surgical training, and then at the same time, as a Canadian, I'm applying back to go to Canada as well. So whatever happens, either one of those two options. But that is a good question because, medicine, there's just so many hoops to jump through. Once you secure the AFP, you got to start thinking about the next stage. Is it IMT that you want to go into? If it's medicine, is it surgical training that you want to go into? And you need to think and have an idea about what criteria they look for so you can start working on it early, because it'll save you so much effort. Have any AFPs had their academic block reallocated? Yes. Yes, they have. AFPs, much like everybody else, have been completely butt-fucked. Understandably, when something once in a lifetime kind of pandemic comes up, everybody's just got to lace up their boots and put in the hard work, and you got to do what you got to do. I wasn't allowed to rotate onto plastics for about a good month and a half, which is really, really shitty because it was the only surgical block I had, and it's what I actually want to go into. But it has happened. And, knock on wood, hopefully there's no second spike that affects people coming in this year. It may happen again. So I guess the short answer for that is yes. I've written my step 1. I don't like the States. So I don't plan on practicing there. But if you want to, you absolutely can. You have to write all 3 steps. And in fact, AL the guy who gave the talk last night, he's writing them mainly so he can go to Israel because they require it. But it does open doors. It's never a bad idea to study for and write a standardized exam. It just opens a lot of doors, but at the same time, they do take a considerable amount of time to prepare for and a lot of money. They're very expensive. Do you think the decile cutoff is dependent on the AFP you applied for you? No. So there's no thing of saying, let's say you apply for a very, I don't know, a more prestigious one, if there is such a thing. For your shortlisting and long listing scores, one of those two cutoffs, I forget which one it is, every single year they look at the applications that they have, and they'll say, we've had 200 applications for 100 spots. Let's interview everybody. There's no decile cutoff. They might put it to like 8. Doesn't matter. I think 3 years ago, the AFP cutoff for London was 6. But then the year that followed, the year that I applied in, the decile cutoff was 2. So it largely depends on how many people apply for these things. I wouldn't worry too much about their criteria. You should just worry about things that are in your control. So, study hard, do the best that you absolutely can, and try to get involved in some research projects. And don't forget that, med school is actually a really sweet time, so try and enjoy yourself as well. Does the AFP will make your CST application more competitive? Not in a direct way, definitely not. So if you look at the rubric for core surgical training, it's pretty clear cut, much like, AFP applications, I guess. You have certain categories of things that you need to fulfill. So doing an AFP in and of itself doesn't make you more competitive on paper. But I would say that people who, as a general trait, something on my computer. As a general trait, I think people who get more competitive positions tend to work hard isn't the right word, tend to maybe be a bit more organized, and they have a bit more idea about future planning so that they, have more time and thought into future applications. So they've already ticked off a lot of the different boxes. It doesn't help for core surgical training. It might help for core medical training. Oops, typo. Does the AFP make your CST more? Oh, okay, cool. From DJ Dave, okay. Is there any way I can connect with you, as I am also looking into moving to Canada in the future? I despise the US system and want some advice. Yes, there are ways you can connect with me. I'm thinking about the best way. If you maybe contact Savannah, and then I can give her, I can give you through her my email or something like that. But if you despise the U.S. system, it's it's not hugely different in applying to Canada.
I just popped my email into, the Study Hub email into that, so you can respond to that.
Apart from getting extra research time during F1, it's F2. What are the other benefits of doing an AFP? So the research time is actually really nice. Especially if you have a lot of different projects that you're working on, it gives you so much more time and free time for admin in general. It also gives you free time, I think, during that research block, because you have so much time to actually do locums and maybe just shadow and get connections and experience in fields that you might find yourself actually really interested in, especially if they're niche ones that you don't generally get placements in. Securing the AFP is a big load off your shoulders, because you can walk into the SJT basically knowing that unless you bomb every single question in the worst way possible, you're guaranteed a pretty sweet job for the next 2 years. And having that extra month and a half, 2 months of no stress while you're in final year of med school, possibly studying for an exam, and it allows you to, you know, plan for your future, look at different places to live in. It's just really nice. But yeah, it's not hugely different from a clinical perspective. Is there a benefit to doing AFP in London over other areas? I'm just thinking about finances. I think it's going to be it's going to be very speculative rather than hard facts. I would say that because London is what it is, and there's a lot of competition from juniors all the way to consultants to come here. So generally, people have a lot better looking CVs, and you'll find the same thing at, you know, places like Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and whatnot. So if I could speculate, I would say that maybe you'll find more distinguished people in their fields to work with. Plus, my own thoughts on the matter is it's rare to get an opportunity to be young and live in a city with as much cultural, economic impact and history. Like, you know, like London. There's few cities around the world like this place. So a benefit of living here is that sometimes on your free time, you can live in and check out one of the coolest places in the world that people spend thousands of dollars to see on their vacation. Oh, I've already answered that. Can one do AFP strictly for the teaching pathway rather than research? If so, what will be the difference between the... There's no difference between the interview process. You just apply for it. I certainly know that there's no difference from the interview process in London, 100%, no difference. Same thing. You just rank it higher. You don't get any sort of personalized questions asking you about your own passion for teaching. I think whatever extra tasks you decide to take on during your actual program is going to be completely up to you. If you can fulfill the requirements of your AFP, which is basically go to every single, you know, do your job, not fuck up too much, get signed off, pass your ARCP, and have something to show for it at the end research-wise, and you're willing to spend extra time outside of this time to do a master's, then yes. But I don't know of an AFP that awards you a master's for doing it, if that is what you're asking. Yes, I did. I quite like teaching. I've done a lot of different lectures that I've organized myself for, like the first year JEPs at St. George's. But I still do that on my own time. I would say the one benefit possibly of doing a med-ed AFP is that you might get some sort of discount depending on the university that you go to, whereby you can maybe attain your PG cert while doing the med-ed portion of your AFP. And that PG cert can help you for certain application processes like the core surgical training. Great. I think that's all the questions.